So, fellow enthusiasts of the Shakespeare authorship question, I'd like to present you something which I found in Alexander Waugh's 19 even-spaced letter grid of the dedication to Shakespeare's sonnets. I'd just like to say at the start that I wouldn't describe myself as a fan of any particular authorship candidate. In fact, I'm really a fan of research on all fronts in order to get to the truth. So it's in this spirit that I'm sharing with you what I found. Just to give you some background, I first became intrigued by the grid when I saw a YouTube video of Alexander Waugh presenting his findings in it at the Shakespeare Authorship Trust Conference in 2016. In his presentation, he spoke about his findings on the left-hand side of the grid, but he said that there was more information to be found on the right-hand side. And throughout his presentation, he impressed upon his audience the fact that everything he had found, or everything to be found, in order to be rendered valid, had to be repeated 3 times or endorsed 3 times by a symbol of Christ. And this was the key to the code. So, knowing that there was something to be found on the right-hand side, and knowing that there was a key, I couldn't resist looking to see if I could find what he had found. So, I did look, and this is the grid. And before I continue, I really strongly urge you to watch Alexander Waugh's presentation on this grid before you continue with this one, because it sets the entire background and puts my presentation into the necessary context. The link is here, as you can see, and these videos of his are called Where Shakespeare is Really Buried. There are 3 parts, but parts 1 and 2 in particular are relevant to this. And please note, Alexander Waugh has not endorsed my findings, and I really don't want to give the impression that he has. Any controversial interpretations of his findings have been my own, so if there's any fallout, please keep it for me. So let's move now to the grid. Before I start, bear in mind that this is a coded message, and as such it has to fit a lot of information into a small space. So some spellings are not exact, other words will be anagrams, but I think this is acceptable if you're trying to squeeze information into a small space. So the first thing I noticed were 2 G's in column 13, and they're set into a cross, symbol of Christ, and it says in signo G, in the sign of God. Underneath I saw I, Jesus, 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 and arranged like the traditional crosses on the hill. And I did recall Waugh saying that a capital G represented God, and that it was often found inside the symbol of the Freemasons with the square and compasses. And as such, I think it can also represent geometry, as it was believed that geometry comes from God. So I looked for some geometry, and a triangle was the obvious image suggested by the 3 eyes. I think you can also say that the triangle is a symbol of the Trinity, which connects God to Christ, and therefore I think that in signo G, in the sign of God, makes G a valid religious endorsement for our purposes. So here we have 3 religious symbols. So what do we find inside the triangle? Having drawn it, the first image to leap out at me was this cross, and in the center of the triangle, the word truth. An anagram, but truth. And I think we certainly have a symbol of Christ there. And what do we find continuing with the triangle? We find the true Earl. Again, Earl isn't spelled correctly, but it patently says Earl. And we've got Hen, Wurra, Henry Wriothesley, all incorporated inside this triangle. So that's interesting. The true Earl, Henry Wriothesley, the Earl of Southampton. So what about this Earl? Looking at the next slide, we actually have Henry Wriothesley, the true nth Earl. So nth, in my opinion, means 18th Earl. And I think this not just because of the E and the N being 18, but also if you look at the columns in simple gematria, 1 equals A, 2 equals B, 3 equals C, and so on. And E therefore equals 5, N therefore equals 13, and if you add them up, you have 18. So Henry Wriothesley, the true 18th Earl. Assuming that this grid is generally speaking about the 17th Earl of Oxford, I think perhaps we can assume that Henry Wriothesley is his son, but it needs to be confirmed, obviously. So let's move along. At this point, I really was struggling to find anything else in this grid, because it's not actually easy to find things in a grid, believe it or not. So I contacted Waugh and I told him what I was doing, that I was trying to independently find what he had found on that right-hand side. I said I was stuck, and I asked him if he could give me a hint as to where to go. He was extremely kind, and he said, if you look in column 9, where he had found EDV lies here, he said I should turn it into a cross. So I went back to the grid, and I could immediately see which kind of a cross it should be. This large cross, and I could see it because I could see the word paternity very clearly inside it at that point. Here we have a statement in which I read, De Vere, he lies, paternity. Alexander Waugh read it differently. He read, he'd Vere's paternity lies, which makes more sense, but basically they come to the same thing. It's an indication that something is not right with the true story. Waugh had also said to me, was I familiar with John Rollett's work? I wasn't, but I familiarized myself with it. And I knew that John Rollett had found the words Henry Wriothesley in a similar grid. It wasn't a 19 grid, but a similar grid. And so I looked for what he'd found, and I actually found Wriothesley across this cross. And I thought, well, there must be an R somewhere because it's missing and we need a Henry. So I found Henry with the missing R in a cross. Henry. So we have Henry Wriothesley on a paternity cross. At this point, where to go next? I looked for a symbol of Christ, and so I found GG here, matching this GG over here. And I thought, okay, this is symbol of God, it's symbol of geometry. So if we have a diagonal going this way, perhaps we should make a diagonal going this way. So we have Christos in the cross. And what do we have on the other side? On the other side, we have Earl, E-A-R-L. I'm ignoring the S-H because it's overlapping, okay? Earl. And then we have N-V-Th. The Envith Earl. So again, if you want to add up the numbers, N in gematria is 13, V in Roman numerals is 5, we have 18. So the 18th Earl. But if that's not enough to convince you, we have Wriothesley, W for Wriothesley in column 5. The columns are important, remember. And H for Henry in column 13. If you add them up, you also get 18. So we have Henry Wriothesley, the 18th Earl. You could say that this is making it 3 times, but I'm saying it's just confirming the second time. And again, the confirmation in Christos and God and God. So that was my next discovery. And now I'd like to move on and bring in what Alexander Waugh found. Not only did he find this paternity cross, but he also found something next to it. It's a phallic symbol with Vere's line in it, which is another suggestion that something is not right with Vere's paternity, with Vere's line. You might say that something was up with Vere's paternity. Waugh also went with John Rollett, and in fact he went exactly with John Rollett and found Eothesley and the WR separately. So Wriothesley, and it's bisecting and connecting the two paternity symbols. He then went on to find Henry, which does exactly the same thing. Henry, bisecting and connecting the two symbols. And finally, he found ipse here, going to column 18. Now, his interpretation for this is different. And this is where I'd like to offer another solution to this, and I actually think it's quite simply telling us that Henry Wriothesley himself, again, is the 18th Earl. And if you put the truth triangle over the top, where you have the truth here, I think you'll find it's connecting everything very clearly, that Henry Wriothesley himself is the 18th Earl, and Vere's line runs in him. We've got Henry Wriothesley himself, with Vere's line running through him. So I actually think this is the third mention of Henry Wriothesley as the 18th Earl, and I think we can back that up even further. If you take these two triangles, which say Vere and Vere, which Alexander Waugh also found, but he had a different interpretation for them, I think you have to say if Henry Wriothesley is the son of Edward de Vere, then he's also Henry Vere. And so I think that this is confirming that Henry is also Henry Vere. There's my Henry. And here is the other Henry from Waugh. And we have Vere as well. We've got Henry Wriothesley Vere. And Henry Wriothesley Vere himself is my son. It comes from Vere's line to the 18th Earl. So I think that confirms yet again that Henry Wriothesley is the son of the Earl of Oxford. So let's move on to slightly more controversial things, if it's possible. Okay, well, of course, if the Earl of Oxford is the father, who is the mother? Well, I had another look at the cross here, and I turned it into an upside-down Chi-Rho symbol, a Chi-Rho cross. And in the central column, we have, he is Vere Tudor. The V is repeated, but the second time it's a U, so I think that's acceptable. So, Henry Wriothesley, and we have the 18th Earl, is Vere Tudor. And we need it confirmed again. Here we have it. We've got Henry Wriothesley, the true Earl, and he's a Tudor. Obviously, it will need confirming a third time, but we will come to that. So let's move on. Now let's concentrate on this right-hand side, which I found this in the middle of the night, actually. Message to. It's in a cross, so it's in a symbol of Christ. And the question is, to whom is it a message? The nearest thing I could find was ER, and balancing it in. So we still have a tau cross. Sometimes the ends of the T come down, so it's a tau cross. Message to ER in. Well, I'm assuming that ER is Elizabeth Regina, but let us continue. So we've got message to ER in, all of this connecting, in revenge. Revenge is not an anagram. And I think I, Jesus, Jesus, Jesus in this diagonal is supporting the fact that we need to follow this line. So, and note the word son right in there, underneath ER and in between revenge. So I think this is a message to Elizabeth Regina in revenge because of my son, or because of our son. Now, the question is, why would, and I'm assuming this is Vere, but of course we need to get it confirmed, and we will do. But the question is, why would he be wanting revenge about his son? And I think we have a little clue here. Speaking of sons, actually it was my son who found silent, and then I found prison next to it. We have silent prison in two crosses next to each other. So silent prison sounds interesting, but what about it? Well, we've got sent to silent prison, and indeed you get sent to prison. So who was sent to silent prison, by whom, and why? Well, here we have I, Vere. So was Vere sent to silent prison? and we have ER, and we have wife. So, I'm not suggesting that Elizabeth Regina was his wife, obviously, but I think the implication is that they were lovers, and if Henry Wriothesley is also a Tudor, Edward is the father, and he was sent to silent prison because of his son. He wasn't allowed to acknowledge his son. And this is from War, and it goes right across the silent prison and the message, and it says E.O. ipse, Edward Oxenford himself. And I think this confirms very nicely that it's Edward Oxenford himself who was sent to silent prison by Elizabeth because he was not allowed to acknowledge their son. Now moving on to Elizabeth, we've got ER here, and the columns are important, as we know. So columns 17 and 18 could well be part of the relationship between the 17th Earl and the 18th Earl, their son. But I thought it would be interesting to use gematria and see what came up, and we've got R and S here. 17 is R, 18 is S, and R I assumed was short for Regina. So I looked it up to see what I could find. I typed in Regina S, and up came Salve Regina, which is a Roman Catholic hymn sung in the Catholic Church. It's medieval, it's in Latin, and translated it reads, Hail, Holy Queen, Mother of Mercy, our life, our sweetness, and our hope, and continues on, Turn then, most gracious Advocate, thine eyes of mercy toward us, and after this our exile, show unto us the blessed fruit of thy womb, Jesus. A heartfelt plea to a virgin queen to reveal the fruit of her womb. This, of course, could be completely coincidence, but it is rather interesting, and if it's a medieval Catholic hymn, I assume it would have been known to Vere. This is possibly a reference, another reference pointing us in the direction to this supposedly virgin queen. Also, the sonnets are full of exile after all. The next thing I found was, I think, continuing the theme of exile, of being unable to acknowledge my son, his son. We've got an H on its side, which I'm assuming is for Henry. And this is the little Latin section. There's a lot of Latin here. And it says, Non est pro me. So Henry is not for me. And over the top of it, we have Rose in the same column as ER. So I am suggesting that this is the third mention of Henry. Henry Tudor is not for me. And I'm also, notice in here we've got the Latin mater for mother intersecting with the Tudor rose. And I think that's again pointing to Queen Elizabeth as the mother of this Henry Tudor here. And lastly, a little cameo we have here of the little family confirmed in Christ 3 times. We've got G once, G twice, and we've got T, 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 the triple tau, and we've got Edward Oxenford, Elizabeth Regina, and son. This comes from Alexander Waugh again, and what I've done is I've just laid it over the top of my Henry is not for me. It's also in Latin. It's a cross which he found, and the words inside the cross spell out sine prole em, which is it's used in heraldry, and it means without male descendants. So I think what this is trying to say is that in this particular case, Edward de Vere is without an acknowledgeable male descendant. Henry is not for me. And again, we have this Edward Oxenford ipse over the top of it, confirming that Henry is not for Edward Oxford. He could never claim him. Incidentally, of course, if there was no male line on Edward de Vere's side, there was also no male line on the Tudor side. And in other words, the heir to the throne. He was denied the acknowledgement of the heir to the throne, if this is true. And so, coming back to column 13, I am suggesting that this truth is put in column 13 specifically because Judas was the 13th disciple, the one who betrayed Christ, and I'm suggesting that Edward de Vere felt betrayed by Elizabeth, and in this way he is getting his revenge by hiding the secret in a code, because how else could he do it? He couldn't do it openly, and if this code is true, then certainly there are plenty of other interesting things hidden in here for posterity. Why not this as well? And if we were in any doubt as to who was talking, who this is all about, we've got two signatures, exactly where you'd expect signatures to be found, in the bottom right. We've got inside an I for Jesus. We've got I, Vere, confirmed in Christ again, I. And we've got will, S, confirmed in Christ again, God and Jesus. So, there is our mystery. Our three-way mystery. Make of it what you will. I can't prove that it's true, but it's certainly interesting, and I leave it with you in the spirit of continuing the research. To paraphrase Oxford, we can say, I found what I found. Thank you very much.